Good evening. As you now know, my name is Ellen Kraft. You also know the title of my presentation tonight. In case you want to leave early, I can tell you the short answer to the question is no. Legal ethics is not an oxymoron. But it may take me a while to show you how I've come to that conclusion. So let me start by telling you a little bit about myself, as I've been asked to do. I'm the youngest child and the only daughter of Joan and Wayne Kraft, the couple in whose memory the Kraft Memorial Lecture has been established here at DeSales. My parents were amazing people. Hopefully you'll enjoy listening to this year's Kraft Lecture on Thursday evening. One of my brothers, Father Thomas Kevin Kraft, a Dominican priest who's currently serving in Kenya and who is here this evening, has traveled a long way to give some insight into his research on married saints and holy couples, with specific attention to those inspired by St. Francis de Sales and St. Jane Francis de Chantal. He may also give some insight into the lives of my parents. I'll try to do the same. I'm still not quite sure why I've been asked to give this lecture this week, though I suspect it has something to do with my last name being Kraft and the fact that I'm a lawyer, and Lori really needed a speaker. I don't really feel that I have anything special to offer you in terms of legal ethics. Quite frankly, I'm not particularly familiar with the life or teachings of St. Francis de Sales. But I do like some of St. Francis's quotes. For instance, nothing is so strong as gentleness, and nothing is so gentle as real strength. My mother made that adage come to life for our family. She was a gentle woman, yet so very strong. I also know that St. Francis was considered to be a legal savant, and that as a bishop and a spiritual counselor, he emphasized that each person should strive to be holy within the context of his or her own calling in life, that lay persons need not feel compelled to mimic monks or religious, but rather should strive to lead their own lives in such a way so as to be as Christ-like as is possible. Isn't that quite simply what it means to be ethical? I mean, if I'm a lawyer by profession, isn't St. Francis suggesting that I should practice law in such a way so as to be as Christ-like as is possible? For some of us, that's harder than others. I was raised with strong Christian moral values by two wonderfully loving parents, but unfortunately, I do not think that my first response in any given situation is to do what's Christ-like, either professionally or personally. My parents did do so. One of my mother's favorite Bible verses was a verse from Micah. All the Lord asks of you is this, to act justly, to love tenderly, and to walk humbly with your God. That really says it all, doesn't it? Act justly, love tenderly, and walk humbly with your God. Whether you're a lawyer, a doctor, a teacher, a student, a priest, a Catholic, a Jew, a Muslim, be ethical in your professional and personal dealings. Act justly, love tenderly, and walk humbly with your God. I'm not quite sure what it is about the legal profession in particular that seems to engender the inquiry as to ethics. I don't often hear people ask whether medical ethics is an oxymoron, and educational ethics is not a common talk show topic. And yet lawyers and the legal profession seem to be a regular target for allegations of unethical behavior. Why is that? Is it because people think that lawyers fail to tell the entire story or somehow stretch the truth? Is it because lawyers are seen as trying to defend guilty people? Is it because lawyers are perceived as being unnecessarily litigious? Is it because lawyers are viewed as ambulance chasers who take advantage of a person's injury or other crisis? Is it because lawyers are often in positions of public scrutiny? Or is it because, as I often caution young attorneys, that in an ideal world, the legal profession would likely not be necessary? Think about that for a moment. Contracts would be enforceable with a handshake. People wouldn't commit criminal acts. If someone was harmed by another person, the responsible party would readily make just compensation. Employers would always be fair to their employees. Estates would pass without incident or taxation to the persons whom the decedent wished. Couples would stay married forever and would always treat each other with love and respect. Real estate interests would be conveyed by verbal agreement, and would always be used for the best and highest use, not only for the owner, but for society in general. Neighbor disputes would simply be talked out and resolved amicably. Taxation would be unnecessary because everyone would simply contribute willingly to whatever cause was needed, and everyone would agree as to the legitimacy of that cause. Care of children, the elderly, and the disabled would never be an issue because everyone would simply take care of one another without the need for supervision or compensation. But we don't live in an ideal world, do we? So is it the lawyers that engender the inquiry, or is it the need for lawyers in this imperfect world that engenders the inquiry? Is it the lawyer, or is it what the lawyer is asked to do? Is it the lawyer, or is it the client that creates the ethical quandary? If you ask 100 people what they think of lawyers in general, you're likely to get an overall negative response. There's too many lawyers, they sue for everything under the sun, they stretch the truth, they charge ridiculous fees, they create problems rather than seeking harmony. And yet, if you ask that same 100 people what they think of their lawyer, I would wager you'll receive a much different response. I love my lawyer. I don't know what I'd do without having my lawyer. My lawyer is wonderful, honest, caring, and smart. Why is that? Part of it is likely public image versus personal experience. Our local and state bar associations are constantly battling the negative public images of attorney. And trust me, it's an uphill battle. When my colleagues and I present at People's Law School, an 8-week mini law school for the general public, the overwhelming response is positive and enthusiastic. How wonderful, friendly, intelligent, well-spoken, and generous these attorneys are. And what a wonderful program it is. And yet there's a reason why I'm reluctant to admit to my profession at a cocktail party. That's often because I will be instantly bombarded with legal queries, ranging from child custody issues to elder law and estate concerns, none of which I could possibly provide appropriate advice to because I'm only hearing one side of the story, and that side is usually alcohol muddled. Nearly 35 years ago, I took an oath when I was sworn in as an attorney in and for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The same oath that every attorney takes after he or she has passed the bar and has met the other requirements necessary for admission. I do solemnly swear that I will support, obey, and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of this Commonwealth, and that I will discharge the duties of my office with fidelity, as well as to the court and as to the client, that I will use no falsehood, nor delay the cause of any person for lucre or malice. I take that oath very seriously, and I believe that most of my colleagues do as well. In addition to the oath that we take, all attorneys are bound by a code of ethics, known in Pennsylvania as the Rules of Professional Conduct. And if a lawyer also serves with the judiciary, as I did for over 30 years, while serving first as a judicial law clerk and later as a divorce master, that lawyer is also bound by the Code of Judicial Conduct. 3-day seminars are presented on the idiosyncrasies of those rules and codes, so I'm not going to go into detail tonight. If you're interested, there are tomes available for your reading pleasure. But I do think that many of the misunderstandings which arise when members of the public think that a lawyer or a judge is being unethical have arisen because there may not be an appreciation of the rules that govern legal and judicial conduct. Part of the reason for the negative public image of attorneys is a result of the public's perception of the rules of professional conduct. The very first paragraph of the preamble states, "A lawyer as a member of the legal profession is a representative of clients, an officer of the legal system, and a public citizen having a special responsibility for the quality of justice." I find that many people believe that lawyers only represent their clients. The preamble goes on to state that as a representative of clients, a lawyer performs various functions. As advisor, a lawyer provides clients with an informed understanding of the client's legal rights and obligations and explains their practical implications. As advocate, a lawyer zealously asserts the client's position under the rules of the adversary system, which, by the way, are a completely different set of rules that lawyers have to learn and abide by when they're in court. As a negotiator, A lawyer seeks a result advantageous to the client, but consistent with honest dealing with others. As an evaluator, a lawyer acts by examining a client's legal affairs and reporting about them to the client or others. My favorite is Section 4. In all professional functions, a lawyer should be competent, prompt, and diligent. My personal belief is that everyone should be competent, prompt, and diligent, but we've already established that we don't live in an ideal world, haven't we? There are obviously situations where a lawyer or a judge's conduct is clearly unethical by any lodestar. My profession is not immune from the societal plague. There are unethical lawyers and judges, just as there are dishonest contractors, unethical doctors, scandalous teachers. But that does not mean that lawyers, as a profession, are unethical, or that lawyers are more unethical than any other profession. I believe quite the contrary to be true. If I had a nickel for every time someone spouted the line from Shakespeare's Henry VI to me, the first thing we do is kill all the lawyers, I'd be long since retired. Almost to a person, those who quote that line from Shakespeare spew it as proof that even in Shakespeare's time, everyone knew the world would be a better place without lawyers. And yet there are many who contend that the line stated by Dick the Butcher was actually an acknowledgement that in order for a dictator or a despot to assume control of a country, law and order must be disrupted by killing all the lawyers. As I understand the latter analysis, Shakespeare was actually complimenting attorneys and judges who serve to instill and protect justice in society and prevent anarchy. Regardless of how you read Shakespeare, I contend that legal ethics are questioned more often than the ethics of any other profession. Maybe I'm just more sensitive to it. Then again, I'm not aware of thousands of doctor jokes out there. And yes, I've heard all the lawyer jokes many times over. When I was a young attorney many eons ago, I was given a wall plaque. Actually, I was given many wall plaques, but I only have so much space on my walls. This one I've kept within eyesight of my desk for more than 3 decades. It's entitled The Lawyer's Creed, and here it is. To some women is granted the gift of practicing the art of law, not a craft or a trade, but a sacred trust to be performed with valiant fidelity, hearing confessions, administering to worldly ills, protecting the weak. Such are the duties of the lawyer. She gives not only of her time and knowledge and ability, she must also give of herself. For the law is a noble art and demands the same nobility that adorns the priest in the confessional, that graces the healing hands of the physician and armors the protecting shield of the knight. It is the nobility of forgetting self and dedicating a lifetime to helping others. So it is that the lawyer must now be the priest, then the physician, and ever the knight, with the armor of honor, the sword of justice, and the shield of truth. Threefold is her oath: keep faith with the judiciary, obey society's code, and yet serve her client with an abiding, eternal, and ever-vigilant loyalty. This last above all, because the lawyer is the conscience, the strength, and the very soul of the client, who entrusts her with his worldly possessions, his liberty, and often his life. And if she be not willing to forgo her own enrichment and best interest for the sake of her client, or should she use her knowledge as a tool to prey upon the less fortunate, and not as a guiding light to truth and justice, then she is not truly a lawyer. But she who says, come whether poor in wealth or broken in spirit, beleaguered by evils or oppressed by enemies, shunned by the world or downtrodden by fate, come and ask for help, here is sanctuary. She who says that and lives it is truly a lawyer. For the lawyer's creed is naught but the teaching of the master lawyer. May God guide me in that creed. I think I've kept that within sight for 35 years because thanks to my parents, certain moral basic tenets were embedded in my psyche from an early age and have stayed with me throughout my life. That I should do a job to the best of my ability or not do it at all. That I should treat all people with kindness at all times. That I should try to make the best of every situation, and that I have a moral obligation to use my God-given talents to make the world a better place. I strive to do these things every day, not only in my professional life, but in my personal life. I certainly don't always succeed. I was also blessed by having as a legal mentor the Honorable Alfred T. Williams, Jr., who was president judge of the Northampton County Court of Common Pleas when I graduated from law school. I accepted a position as his law clerk and was immersed in the sea of his judicial counsel. That a lawyer should be part of the solution and not part of the problem. That legal argument is intended to shed light, not heat. That the primary job title of an attorney is counselor at law, not litigator. And if you end up in court, you have already done both your client and the court a disservice. That a good attorney knows his case inside and out. A great attorney knows the other side's case. That the practice of law is a profession, not a business. I hope you're seeing a common thread here. Treat everyone with kindness and respect. Use our God-given talents to make the world a better place. If you're a lawyer, competently represent your client while being honest with the court and all parties. Be part of the solution and not part of the problem. Isn't that what being ethical is all about? Looking back, I realized at a young age that I developed a number of life skills that I rely on today in the practice of law. Skills that can be used in an ethical or in an unethical manner. The choice is mine. And it really has nothing to do with what I do for a living. It has more to do with how I live my life. Having 3 older brothers, all of whom are here, by the way, I readily developed the ability to defend myself, both physically and verbally. My poor father was horrified when I announced at the dinner table one evening that I was the toughest kid in the 2nd grade. I had even bested all the boys at King of the Hill, and I was very proud of that distinction. My poor father was crestfallen. Thankfully, I don't often have to use my physical defense skills as an attorney. There have been occasions, but that's for another night. My verbal defense skills began with standing up to my brothers and telling them that you're not the boss. I've refined those skills a bit over time. Considering that I spend most of my days either talking or writing, verbal skills are important. My brothers will tell you that I developed a dramatic flair at an early age. I must admit that I loved theater growing up, not watching theater, but participating in it, being on stage. And that's a skill that has certainly come in handy as a lawyer, not only in the courtroom, but even across the negotiating table. I also learned at an early age that I loved to solve puzzles. All types of puzzles, but my favorite by far were and still are jigsaw puzzles. I'm sure that part of that love comes from fond memories of doing jigsaw puzzles with my paternal grandmother. It really is something that all ages can do together, and she and I developed a special bond doing jigsaw puzzles. But to this day, I still like to do jigsaw puzzles. There's something calming and centering about fitting together the colors and the shapes. Almost a Zen-like experience, especially after a difficult, frustrating day at the office where things don't always come together so easily. And I often use the analogy when I review a complex matter with a client or opposing counsel that some of the pieces to this puzzle are missing. It's hard to solve a puzzle without all the pieces. And for as long as I can remember, I've liked to talk. Those in the audience who know me are saying that that's an understatement. My mom used to tell me the story about a grade school parent-teacher conference when my teacher complained that Ellen talks to everyone. Mom and Dad inquired as to whether I was disrupting the class or interrupting the teacher by doing so. And she said, no, but she talks to everyone all the time, even when she crosses the room to sharpen her pencil. The teacher explained to my parents that she seated the class outcast next to me with hopes of silencing me. But Ellen even talked to him. Now she has the whole class talking to him. My mother apparently responded, well, isn't that a good thing that this poor boy is no longer a social outcast? The teacher reluctantly agreed. So I was vindicated, and I've been talking ever since. It wasn't too long after grade school that I discovered I also liked to argue, sometimes just for the sake of arguing, playing the devil's advocate, so to speak. But I think it's more that by doing so, I force myself and the person with whom I'm arguing to look at an issue from a different perspective. And it forces me not only to defend, but to define my own point of view. Not sure why I always liked to do it. Maybe it was innate. Or maybe it was because I had 3 older brothers who were really smart and were always right about everything. I wanted to try to prove them wrong, or at least make them work for it. All 3 of my brothers were and still are really smart. And my parents were both really smart. We didn't watch much TV growing up. My dad called it the boob tube. And of course, there were no computers or video games back then. We read a lot of books, we spent a lot of time outside, and we played the dictionary at dinner table after dessert. I think there's a commercial game called Balderdash that's very similar to that now. Anyway, I still like to argue, as long as those with whom I'm arguing can remain civil, which is becoming very rare these days. It seems to me that everyone takes things personally. Everyone is so easily offended, and everyone seems to think that if you don't agree with them, you're either ignorant or uninformed. Or worse, you're evil, you're closed-minded, or you're a bigot. Maybe you're mentally deficient, you're naive, or you're merely a mouthpiece for some cause. Or you're some type of phobe. There's so many phobias being thrown around these days, I have to look them up in the dictionary. God forbid that you actually have a well-reasoned, informed, and morally defensible opinion that simply differs from theirs. These days, I find there's a growing number of people who refuse to even listen to a differing opinion, much less discuss it. The mere existence of a contrary mindset offends them. It scares them, and to me, that's the saddest part of all, especially on college campuses, where it used to be the norm to hear all sorts of differing viewpoints about everything from religion and politics to art and literature. When I was in college, that was the whole point. It was a safe environment in which to express and debate differing views of the world. It's how we figured out who we were and how we fit into the world. Nowadays, it seems that open discussion is suppressed on college campuses and in many other forums. For any of you that have studied the law or have been involved in litigation or have served on a jury, you may be familiar with the legal doctrine of the reasonable man standard. Oversimplified, it basically dictates that if a reasonable man would have done the same thing under the same circumstances, there's probably no legal liability for negligence or for damages. It does not necessarily mean that the subject person had a good reason for doing what he did in that particular instance. It just means that a reasonable man would or could have done the same thing. There is a difference. Setting aside for the moment that nobody really knows what defines a reasonable man, reasonable is a term often used in the law. Reasonable care, reasonable belief, reasonable cause, reasonable certainty, reasonable force, reasonable suspicion. The list goes on and on. So what is the definition of reasonable? The American Heritage Dictionary defines it as fair, proper, just. So does it necessarily follow that if there is a reason for doing something or believing something, that the result is fair, proper, or just? Stated another way, if an opinion is well-reasoned, does it mean the opinion is fair, proper, or just? Is it subjective? One person may be of the opinion that a certain belief or a certain behavior is fair, while another person may find that same belief or behavior to be patently unjust. And yet both positions might be reasonable. We all know that what is reasonable under one set of circumstances may be absolutely unreasonable under another set of circumstances. So how do we determine what is reasonable? And necessarily following that, how do we determine what is ethical at any given time? When I think of discussing well-reasoned opinions, I always think of my father. My father loved to discuss things. Philosophy was one of his favorite subjects. And I think in many ways he was a philosopher at heart, though a metallurgical engineer by training. He loved the teachings of Teilhard de Chardin, and in fact wrote several books on Teilhard. I loved my father dearly. I was definitely Daddy's little girl. But one of my father's favorite expressions used to drive me crazy. If you understood, you would agree. I think it might be a German thing, or maybe it's a guy thing, I don't know, but Dad really believed it. He believed that if things were talked through long enough and explained clearly enough, everyone would eventually agree. That went for things as small as where to go on family vacation and things as large as world peace. If you understood, you would agree. I disagree. I told you I like to argue. I think that people are intrinsically different. Our life experiences are different. Our education has been different. We've been shaped by different forces, hurt and loved by different people. Born in different decades and into different circumstances. We're biologically and genetically different. And I think that these differences are not only what make us who we are, but are what make the world interesting. Based on my opinion that people are intrinsically different, an opinion, by the way, which I happen to think is both a reasonable opinion and a well-reasoned opinion, I conclude that there are some things on which we will never agree. And when I say we, I mean the proverbial, all-encompassing we. Men, women, Christians, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, atheists, lawyers, engineers, professors, students, whomever. I firmly believe that there are some things on which we have to respectfully disagree with one another. I used to tell my father, I understand what you're saying, I just disagree. He'd get frustrated and say, no, might not have explained myself clearly enough, let me try another way. And I'd respond, you explained your position clearly, I understand what you're saying, I just disagree. We'd go on, both too stubborn to acquiesce. By stating all of this, I in no way intend to imply that I understand everything, because with each passing day, I realize I understand less and less of this world. In fact, most days I feel as though I exist in a parallel universe. And that means that there are some times when I disagree because I don't understand. But more often, I think I do understand someone else's point of view, I just disagree. Interestingly enough, and perhaps ironically, I also believe that there are some things that cannot be reasonably disputed, that if we understand, we will agree. And I think that that belief is also a reasonable belief. I don't think that everything is relative, that there is no right or wrong, that there are no absolutes. To the contrary, I believe there are certain absolutes, and there are certain things on which we can, should, and often do agree. There's certain factual absolutes. As the earth rotates, it also revolves around the sun, sort of. I was just reading something that doesn't revolve around the sun, it revolves around the center of the universe, but it sort of revolves around the sun. When it rains, things get wet. Those are factual absolutes. Obviously, there are others. But not all factual absolutes are that easy. As our worlds expand and our understanding of science becomes more sophisticated, there are things in which we thought were factual absolutes, which turn out to be incorrect. Classic example is the belief that the earth was flat. One cannot help but wonder what factual absolutes of today will be determined down the road to be absolutely incorrect. In my experience, many arguments arise when one person or one group of people believes that a certain premise is based on a factual absolute, and another person or another group of people has a different idea as to what the facts are, which necessarily changes their premise. And yet the two sides often fail to recognize that they disagree as to the underlying facts. Rather than try to understand and argue the validity of the other side's factual assumptions, the parties to the argument simply apply their opponent's premise to their own set of facts and conclude the opposing point of view is idiotic, untenable, or simply wrong. My parents taught me not to believe everything I hear. The Jesuits, I graduated from St. Joe's. A hawk will never die. Sorry, Father. The Jesuits taught me to do my homework and to question things that may appear to be factual. And law school taught me to try to determine what the other side thinks that the facts are, and then determine how those facts affect their premise so that it can be challenged. The same theory applies to certain moral or ethical absolutes. I believe there are certain moral absolutes. It's just that they may be more difficult to prove than factual absolutes. And perhaps therein lies the rub. One cannot really prove a moral absolute. The mere fact that a certain percentage of the population thinks something is morally acceptable does not make that something a moral absolute. Though perhaps the more people who believe it to be a moral absolute or exhibit behavior which indicates they believe it to be a moral absolute, the more we should review our own conclusions. As a sociology major at St. Joe's, I was taught the progression of acceptable societal behavior from norm to mores to law. I'm reaching back a ways now, so bear with me. But if I recall correctly, an oversimplified explanation explains that a behavior which becomes the norm or custom in a given society may eventually progress to becoming a more in that societal group, meaning that the behavior now carries moral significance. A more is something viewed by the society as appropriate behavior, rather than as simply being the usual behavior. So from a sociological perspective, a more is the term given to a social norm that has greater moral significance than other norms. In addition to defining appropriate behavior, mores can also define inappropriate behavior. For instance, an aversion for societal taboos like incest or child pornography. Not all norms become mores. Another way to distinguish a norm from a more is that mores dictate right from wrong, whereas norms dictate right from rude. And under certain circumstances, a more makes the societal leap to become a law. Once a more becomes a law, the behavior carries societal rewards or penalties. So from a sociological perspective, and also from an ethical perspective, problems arise when laws precede mores. To try to legislate behavior that is at best a norm rather than a more leads to all sorts of challenges, both ethically and legally. An example from last night's lecture is the legalization of abortion. At the outset, there is some legitimate disagreement as to whether abortion had even become a societal norm at the time it was legalized. Though if we are to believe the statistics as to the number of abortions performed on a daily basis, I would suggest that it had become a social norm for a number of decades, at least within certain societal subgroups. I would argue, however, that abortion had not become a social more before it was enacted into legislation. Hence, some real problems arose from both a legal and an ethical perspective. Let me give you an example. The law has long recognized and continues to recognize a child in utero as a human being under certain circumstances. For instance, if a pregnant woman is murdered, the perpetrator can be, and often is, charged with double homicide. So if a child in utero can be a victim of a homicide, how did lawmakers reconcile that with the legalization of abortion? I would note that most arguments in favor of legalized abortion do not deny that the fetus is a human being under the law. Instead, they focus on the fact that the fetus is not yet independently viable, that the fetus is part of the mother's body while in utero, and that the mother has a right to her own body. If that's the case, then why are there any restrictions at all on abortion? After all, a child remains a part of the mother's body until birth, and even a newborn child is not independently viable. I would suggest that it's because societal mores kicked in and shaped the laws retroactively. To date, social mores have clearly prevailed to an extent because most states do not yet permit late-term or partial birth abortion. For some reason, legislators and their constituents have determined that a fetus who looks more like a newborn baby and is closer to birth should be protected. That makes no sense to me. Either you believe that a fetus is a human being who deserves the protection of our laws from the moment of conception, or you believe that a mother's right to her own body trump, and the mother, not the father, by the way, who doesn't have any rights until the child is born, but the mother can make a decision to abort up until the time of birth. Logically, factually, legally, ethically, the distinctions between types of abortions make no sense to me. I feel the same way about compromised moral and legislative arguments in favor of abortion in cases of incest or rape. If you truly believe that life begins at conception, then it is no less a life simply because the circumstances of conception were against current societal mores. I should make a personal disclosure here. My maternal grandmother contracted German measles when she was pregnant with my mother. My brothers and I would not be here if my maternal grandmother had believed in abortion, because her decision to carry my mother to term was against the medical advice given to her, which was to abort, medical advice which was reasonable at the time. There are myriad other examples of the disconnect between laws and social mores when legislation either precedes or surpasses the parameters of an existing social more. Too many to mention here. I hope the subjectivity of the law and the challenges facing the lawyer in terms of ethics are becoming obvious. It should also now be obvious how I ended up becoming a lawyer. I know how to defend myself and others. I have a dramatic flair. I like to solve puzzles. I like to talk. I like to argue. And I believe it's my moral obligation to use those skills to help people. I do all of that as a lawyer every day. Sometimes I even get paid for it. I never really wanted to be a lawyer, at least I never really wanted to practice law. Many days I still don't. But after graduating from St. Joe's with a dual degree in sociology and criminal justice, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. Social workers were a dime a dozen, and although I had thought I might want to be a probation officer, that never really materialized for a variety of reasons. My paternal grandfather was both a lawyer and a judge, but I never met him because he died before I was born. My maternal grandfather gave me great advice, the same advice I give young people today. If you have the brains, the time, and the money, go to law school. You don't need to practice law, but the training is invaluable. My maternal grandfather had to leave school in the 8th grade to help support the family, so he really valued an education. I took the law boards, the GREs, and the MCATs, If I recall correctly, I did okay on all of them, but I had volunteered in a hospital and had worked in a nursing home for a number of years. I don't really like blood, and I don't like being around sick people, so that kind of ruled out medical school. And I didn't really think that a master's degree was going to cut it in terms of financial self-sufficiency, so I ended up in law school. Why not? Why not go to live in a different part of the country and have some fun and delay the real world for a while? Why not? I can tell you now, I was completely incorrect about it being fun. I did have some fun, and I made some lifelong friends while in law school. I received my doctorate of law from the Marshall Wythe School of Law at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. After 3 very long years, I hated most of it. As the saying goes, the first year they scare you to death, the second year they work you to death, and the third year they bore you to death. I don't remember ever being bored. And although I pretty much hated law school, I concede it was a great education, and it did teach me how to think. The Jesuits taught me how to study, how to learn, how to appreciate different philosophies and traditions. But law school taught me how to think, how to analyze. There's really no one correct answer in law school. There are many correct answers, kind of a life lesson. I mean, there are some basics you have to learn: laws of intestate succession, what's necessary to form a valid contract, what constitutes marital property. But for the most part, after the first year, you get credit for coming up with as many correct answers to a problem as you can. A good law school trains you to look for as many possible solutions to any given situation as you can. There are always multiple sides to a situation, and as a lawyer, as a counselor at law, your job is to try to understand each possible aspect so that you can come up with a solution. But I struggled with the concept of justice throughout law school, at least what I thought of as justice going into law school. The American Heritage Dictionary defines justice as moral rightness, equity, honor, fairness. In the law, there are terms such as just cause, just compensation, just debt. To me, as a 21-year-old law student, justice and ethics were kind of interchangeable. I thought justice meant compliance with what I believed to be an all-encompassing moral code. It meant ending up with the right result, and somehow strict adherence to the law didn't always seem to produce the right result. Legal ethics at Marshall Wythe was taught by the dean of the law school to third-year students. Dean William B. Spong was actually a rather prestigious figure in the Tidewater area of Virginia. After I had complained repeatedly during ethics class that this or that just wasn't right or wasn't fair or didn't seem equitable, he lost patience with me. "Ms. Kraft, this here is law school. You want justice, I suggest you go to the seminary." Being who I am, I shut up, but I couldn't let that be the last word. So on the last day of ethics class, I borrowed a Roman collar from the parish priest at St. Bede's in Williamsburg and wore it to class. Poor Dean Spong. To this day, I'm not sure that he realized I just borrowed the Roman collar. I don't think it matters whether you attend law school or the seminary. After 35 years, it all circles back to what my parents taught me from the beginning, what Judge Williams showed me as a young attorney. Legal ethics isn't an oxymoron. It's really rather simple. Act justly, love tenderly, and walk humbly with your God. Thanks for letting me do one of my favorite things, and that's talk.